Hey guys, it's Betty, and today we are going to talk all about how to maintain your sourdough starter. Now hopefully if you are watching this video, you have been following along the Sourdough for Beginners series, and you have a really nice and active starter that you are ready to start baking with. But if you're new to this series, there is a link down in the description for this playlist, so you can go ahead and get caught up with us. Okay, let's talk about maintaining our starter. Now there are two main ways that you can store your sourdough starter. You can store it out on the counter, or you can store it in your refrigerator. Now storing it on the counter is the ideal way to store your starter because feeding it very regularly is going to be the best way to keep it really nice and active. But if you do keep it at room temperature, you do need to feed it every single day. And I totally understand if that's not something you want to do. If you don't want to feed your starter every day, then you can store it in the refrigerator. So cold temperatures are going to really slow down the activity of your yeast and bacteria, so you won't need to feed it as frequently. If you do store it in the refrigerator, ideally you need to feed it every 7 to 10 days. Now, if you kind of forget about your starter for a while and don't feed it for a few weeks, do not throw it out. Sourdough starters are very resilient and they're actually very difficult to kill. So if you forget about it for a few weeks, go ahead and give it a few regular feedings and it should become active again. Okay, so let's go ahead and do our maintenance feeding. Now we are going to use the same ratios that we've been using in the last few days, and that is a 1-3-3 feeding. So if you remember, this means that we keep 1 part starter and we add 3 parts flour and 3 parts water. The only thing we are going to change this time is we're going to be giving it part wheat flour and part unbleached all-purpose flour. So if we keep 25 grams of our starter like we've been doing the past few days, we're going to give it 25 grams of whole wheat flour and 50 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour. Now this equals a total of 75 grams of flour, just like we've been doing over the past few days. The only difference here is 1/3 of that flour is whole wheat and 2/3 of that flour is all-purpose flour. So don't get too overwhelmed with this. I have written it all out in the written post and in the printable schedule that is linked down in the description. So let's go ahead and feed our starter. Now my jar that I've been building my starter in is getting a little bit crusty, so I'm going to move it into a clean jar. And I typically do this about every 7 days when I am doing daily feedings, but just use your best judgment, and when your jar looks like it's ready for a new one, go ahead and move it into a clean jar. Now make sure you do take the weight of your empty jar when you're moving it into a clean jar and write that down so that you know how much the jar weighs when you go to do your feedings. So mine weighs 655 grams. Okay, now I'm going to tare my scale and I'm going to add 25 grams of my starter into my new jar. Now my starter was fed 24 hours ago. It has already fallen completely, which means it is hungry and it's ready to be fed. So 25 grams of starter, and then we're going to add 25 grams of whole wheat flour. Perfect. And then we need 50 grams of our unbleached all-purpose flour. And this flour does need to be unbleached or it will not work very well in your starter. Okay, and now we just need to add our 75 grams of water. And remember, this water has been warmed up to about 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, and just like we've been doing every other day, we will mix that together until it is well combined. Now that I have fed my starter, it should be ready for me to use in a bread dough within about the next 6 to 12 hours. And you always want to be sure that all of that flour is completely absorbed in. And I'm just going to cover this again, not airtight, and let it start fermenting. So now that your starter is really nice and active, you can actually start saving your sourdough discard. So I'm actually going to move this into a clean jar and store it in the refrigerator. And every day I go to feed my starter, I will just keep adding my discard to that jar. Now there are quite a few different things that you can do with your sourdough discard, and there's an entire video coming out soon all about that, so look out for that video. So now that your starter is nice and fed, there are a few different things you can do with it. You could bake with it later today, which is what I am going to do with mine. So it should be ready to bake with in about 6 hours and anywhere up to 12 hours after you feed it. And the way you know that your starter is ready to be added into a bread dough is you do the same float test that I showed you in the last video. So you're going to take a spoonful of your starter and very gently drop it in a cup of water. And if it floats, then it is vigorous enough to add into a bread dough. Now, once it gets to that point where it is vigorous enough, you usually have a few hours time frame for it to stay vigorous enough to put it in your bread dough. But at a certain point, it is going to start falling, and then it won't be active enough to use in your bread dough. So if you do that float test and it doesn't float, it either isn't ready or you have waited too long and it has started to fall and is losing all of that volume. Now I'm going to be using about 100 grams of this starter in a bread recipe later today, which is my easiest sourdough recipe, and that will be coming up in a video soon. But tomorrow when I go to feed this, that means I'll only have a little bit of starter to discard when I do my feeding. Now on days when I'm not going to be baking with my starter, I will often keep a smaller portion of it and do our same ratios of feedings, but that way I don't have as much to discard the next day. Now, if that is too confusing for you, just go ahead and do the same feeding every time and that is going to work out just fine. But if you are interested in learning how to reduce your discard and you have questions about that, go ahead and ask me in the comment section. Now, if you do want to store your starter in the refrigerator, after you feed it, let it sit out on your counter for a few hours until it gets nice and bubbly. Then you can go ahead and put it in the refrigerator. When you're ready to feed it again, take it out of the refrigerator and feed it as you normally do, and then let it sit out again for a few more hours before you store it back in the refrigerator. Now, if you do want to bake with your starter and you've been storing it in the refrigerator, you usually want to take it out with enough time to give it a few feedings before you start your bread dough. So if I want to start a bread dough on a Friday, I'll typically take my starter out of the refrigerator on Wednesday and feed it Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday so it's nice and active to use in my bread dough. Now I know this is a lot of information to take in, but please don't let it stress you out. I have written everything in detail in my full written article that is linked down in the description box. The main thing to remember about your sourdough starter is you need to keep a little bit of starter and give it water and flour. That's really it. If you forget to feed it sometimes, or if you mess up the ratios every once in a while, it's going to be okay. Just get back on schedule and it's going to work out great for you. If you have any questions for me, please leave those down in the comment section and let me know how your sourdough starters are going. Okay, I'll see you guys next time.